Good evening, everybody. Monday Morning Quarterback, episode 150. It's been a minute since I've been able to go live with you guys, so I apologize for that. Just been super busy with racing with Hudson and getting to races with customers and working really hard on some new products for next year. And so, haven't been able to do as many lives as I would like. But we'll get back in the swing of things here as the season starts to taper off, and we have some good programs planned for you. Tonight we're going to talk about some of the most common suspension myths and kind of break you through those. So a bit of a myth buster type episode. If you have any questions along the way, go ahead and ask those. I have the Facebook comments over here. Now that I don't do these every single week, I feel like they change it every time, but I think I can see your comments. Somebody comment that you got us loud and clear, and that way we can answer your questions throughout. And always, if we miss your question, I'll always try to go back and answer it if I see it. Otherwise, you can message me on Facebook or via email, or always give us a call, and more than happy to answer any of your technical questions, whether it pertains to tonight's topic or not. So hope you all been doing well since the last time we got to catch up. And I just got to watch Kyle Larson win over at Raceway Park and Jerome Rodello's midget with our shocks. So that was really cool to see. Actually got first and second in the midget race. So our pavement program is still going strong. We had a really good year over there last year as well. So, and that's a fun fact. That's how I honestly started CSI. So grew up midget and sprint car racing. My career took me down the IndyCar road, and was a damper engineer in IndyCar. Did some time in NASCAR, and then went back to IndyCar. And when I started CSI, USAC pavement racing was a big deal. And so I thought that would be my niche, is I could bring some of the stuff I learned in NASCAR and IndyCar and build a better shock. And at that point, we were just tuning Penske shocks, but we could come up with a better piston package and really help guys on the pavement side. And that's how what started our business. And not long after, pavement racing kind of died. And so we transitioned into the dirt side, which was dirt's always been my first love. And transitioned into the dirt side, and we got known more as a dirt company. But now that pavement racing's making a resurgence, it's really cool. Prior to this deal they've been getting going at Raceway Park, it's just been Little 500 was kind of the only marquee pavement race we did all year. So good. Alex, Greg, thank you for joining in. Michael, appreciate you guys. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to fire away with those, and then I'll kind of run through my list. I tried to come up with our most common questions and things that get overlooked pretty easily. And sometimes what might seem obvious to some isn't to others, because we just have a wide range of knowledge with our customers. So we have everything from the guy that is just getting a quarter midget or a micro for his kid to start racing, and they don't know anything about it. Their family wasn't into racing, and so they're trying to learn and be a sponge and soak up everything they need, to professional race teams that this is what they do for a living. And some of those crew chiefs are much more knowledgeable than me because they do it every day. So a wide range of customers we have here, and so I try to hit on all of them, and that's what we're going to do tonight. So the first myth is the shock changes based on which direction you mount it, shaft up, shaft down. That's busted. That is not true. There would be a very slight difference in sprung versus unsprung weight, but as far as the actual dampening of the shock, the valving of the shock, it is not changed whether the shock is mounted shaft up or shaft down. And that's across our whole product line, whether it's a quarter midget shock, a twin tube, a mono tube. The shock dampening force will not change no matter which orientation it's mounted. So that's the first one. Second one is that a stiffer right rear shock is going to improve the handling on your car on a rough racetrack. Busted. While more high-speed compression can improve the platform on a rougher track, there is a limit to that. So stiffer is not always better. Too stiff on a shock can cause the contact patch of the tire to bounce off the racing surface. So if you get too stiff, you will actually have a decrease in grip and a rougher ride. Oftentimes, a softer rebound works really well and improves the ride quality on a rougher racetrack. So stiffer's not always better. I know in the olden days, tracks would be tacky, hooked up, choppy, big curb. Put a 6 shock on the right rear, right? Take the 4, the 5 off and put a 6 on the right rear. Well, you're stiffening compression and rebound when we were doing that, and the stiffer rebound was actually hurting things. So I'm just going to check real quick and see if you guys, no other questions so far. Okay, we'll keep rolling. I'm all decked out tonight. I came from a really special event that I was invited to by the Clausen family. They have a new suite at the Indiana Donor Network for families who's has lost a loved one and they're donating organs. A place for them the family to gather with that donor hero is what they call it, with that donor hero kind of in their last moments. So really, really cool and was special and glad I got to do that. So that's why I'm not in a racing shirt tonight like you would normally see me. The second myth is a gas shock has no oil in it. That is not true. Almost every gas or monotube shock has some type of suspension fluid in it. The one that would not have oil would be like an air spring, like you would see on a motocross bike or a mountain bike, something like that. Maybe a snowmobile sled might run an air spring, and that's actually an air setup, not oil and gas. So, but even some of those do have oil in it, depending. So, if it's a gas shock, we've had customers call. My shock's leaking oil, and I purchased a gas shock from you, so I'm not sure where this is coming from or what. It shouldn't have oil in it, but yes, all gas shocks have oil, and twin tube shocks have gas in them as well. That could be another myth. It's just sealed in a bag. All right, so we've done some really good Monday morning quarterbacks on the difference between a monotube and a twin tube. So if you're not quite sure on that, that's a really good one to check out. Another myth. Shock adjustments will fix an ill-handling race car. While shock adjustments can be the best way to maximize your setup and improve the performance, not every ill-handling condition or setup deficiency can be fixed with a shock. So the shock isn't designed to overcome a certain deficiency in your car. Once you have a good platform and a good baseline, absolutely shocks are probably the number one thing to dial your setup in. But if the car is totally ill-handling, more than not, unless you just got a shock that's failed, but more than not, a shock valving or shock adjustment click setting isn't going to dial that car back in. There's a problem within the setup. So that can sometimes get you in trouble, right? We were talking about the stiffer right rear shock helping on a rough racetrack. You know, if you go out and you have 4 pounds of air in your right rear tire when the track conditions call for 8 or 9, there's nothing you're going to do to that shock that's going to be able to compensate for the lack of air pressure and the deflection you're going to get in the sidewall of that tire. It just wasn't designed for that. So hope that makes sense. A couple questions. Greg, low bleed in the rough. So it depends on if you're talking about compression or rebound bleed. Less bleed will obviously provide a stiffer dampening and a stiffer platform. Typically on the rebound side, we would like more bleed when the track's rough. And the best way to describe that is like a motocross bike. Those guys run almost zero rebound or as light a rebound as they can get. So through the whoop section, the tire can stay in contact with the track. So if you have a very stiff rebound, as the shock or damper compresses, and it hits the next bump, it hasn't returned the tire to the track quick enough. So then it'll hit the face of that next edge. So the same thing could be on a sprint car track. If you've got a big hole and it's followed by a series of holes and the tire hits that hole and compresses up, if it can't return back to the racetrack before it hits the next one, it really gets to chopping and bouncing. Alex, if you're trying to match 3-inch per second number from a monotube to a twin tube shock, does the gas pressure in the monotube make a difference? A couple things with that. A monotube shock, more times than not, is going to feel slightly stiffer than a twin tube, even a base valve monotube, because of the rising spring rate inside the shock. So as the shock's compressed, the divider piston moves, the internal spring rate rises in the shock. Now, if you just put a stiffer, more gas pressure in it, it's going to make it feel like it has more compression and less rebound. But really, it's just because we've stiffened the spring rate inside the shock. And so as you go with a stiffer spring, it's harder to compress and it springs back quicker. So hope that answers your question. Typically, if I have a customer that's going back and forth, we'll typically go with a slightly softer compression setting on a monotube versus their twin tube to get a similar feel. So good question. Did I miss anybody else? No. Okay. So the next myth is if my shocks aren't leaking and I've stroked them by hand and they feel okay, they don't need serviced. Again, that's not totally accurate. Simply put, your shock is just a piston moving up and down in a cylinder similar to your engine. And it can only do that action so many times until parts start to wear out, oil starts to break down, etc. If you have more than 25 races on your shocks, I promise your car will handle better if they've been freshened by a proper shock technician. Your setup changes will be more pronounced. If you feel like your car is starting to get lazy, it's not responding to weight changes, it just doesn't feel how it did early in the season, very well could be because your shocks need freshened. Even if a shock dyno's okay sometimes, if it's got a ton of races on it, freshen it. New oil, new seals. The sooner you do that, the less expensive the repairs are because the less parts we have to replace. So if you got a shock, to exaggerate it, that has 100 nights on it, the oil is so dirty and so broke down that aside from the common seals that are going to need to replace, you might be looking at a piston band that needs to be replaced, or a pressure tube, or it's maybe pitted the actual main piston because of the dirt that's been slapping between the shim and the piston face. So those repairs and rebuilds can get much more expensive. So again, 25 races max. If you race on a really rough track, 20 races. So obviously I have the ability to rebuild my shocks as frequently as I want. And I don't ever put more than 10 on them because of that luxury. And I know that it will help the performance of the car. So, and dyno them about every other race. So, is a 1-inch adjustable shock worth looking at for a wing sprint car? What do you mean by a 1-inch adjustable shock? I'm not sure, Zach, what exactly you mean by that. If you mean the shock's adjusting at 1 inch per second, because most all shocks adjust at 1 inch per second. So reiterate your question there, and I'll try my best to answer it. So another myth is that all shock dynos are relatively the same. So we'll get this call frequently. Hey, I got my shocks from you. Said the right front was 75 pounds of compression. I put it on my buddy's dyno. It's 60. There must be something wrong with the shock. Not necessarily. I recommend for anybody that has a shock dyno or has close access to a shock dyno, and that's what you're going to use to reference your shocks, when you get them from us or your shock manufacturer, put them on that dyno and make a reference, and that's your new starting point baseline. So before you ever turn a lap with them, put them on that dyno, and that's going to be your reference point that if something's ever moved, okay? Each shock dyno manufacturer, they have their own software. How they generate that data and present it to you is different, okay? We just made a huge transition here. We've been on Rohrig shock dynos and software since I started the company, and I used it my whole career in IndyCar and NASCAR. And without getting into details, Rohrig's kind of going away. A couple guys from Rohrig started a new shock company, and we'd been working with them for a few years. And so we switched to CTW, and just had to be done. And there's a lot of pluses to their new software, and it's continuing to be developed, and it's continuing to advance where the other software was going to fall behind in short order. So we've seen some slight differences. How are you testing it? Okay, what speed are you testing at? If you don't test it at the same speed as the shock manufacturer tested it, you're going to get a different result. Are you dynoing it at 1-inch displacement or 2-inch or half-inch? That's going to change it. CVP or PVP, that's going to change it. So again, reference point on the dyno that you're going to use, or whoever's going to dyno the shocks for you when they're new, and that's going to be the best way to know. So for more on that, episode 68, how a shock graph is generated. All of our Monday Morning Quarterbacks are on our YouTube page. So go over to CSI Shocks at YouTube. Please subscribe while you're there. Look up episode 68. It's a few years old, but I talk about how that shock dyno graph's generated, what's important to know, what's important to look at, so you're comparing apples to apples. So it'd be no different if you bought an engine from one guy and he said, hey, this thing's got 850 horsepower, and you take it down the road to another guy and he says, this thing's 780. Well, it's the same engine. Nothing's changed. You haven't run it. It's just with an engine dyno, how they, different dynos read different, and then what kind of air numbers they put in and correction factors and whatnot can change that. So, okay. Greg, how relatable is real race shocks to RC shocks? Good question. So we did RC shocks for a while. We helped design some pistons and then eventually a whole shock for the 8-scale off-road market, and it was really cool. We actually even worked with one of our partners to build a shock dyno to learn. And it's relatable. The biggest difference is typically there's not a shim stack. There's been a couple companies that have come out on the RC side with a shim stack shock. The challenge is getting them soft enough with the shim. So typically you're controlling your dampening by the weight of the oil you use in an RC shock, and then you're controlling kind of your internal spring rate by how much or how little oil you put in them. So that's how you get the difference there. So on the off-road side, that's a big deal, how they land, how the shocks pack up, because basically at some point they almost hydraulic lock. So yeah, I mean, the principles are the same, but the actual internal design is slightly different. Most shocks in the racing world are deflective disc, and the RCs are a little more simplistic. So. Dan Kerr, the Pro A2. So that shock is just it just has a very slight tapered needle in it. Okay, so basically you're adjusting mainly low speed and not much 3-inch. Pretty much all of our high-end wing sprint car teams, that's what they use, is that style of needle in our shock. So reason being is those crew chiefs, they know exactly what 3-inch number they want for the given track. They're more concerned with adjusting their rebound closed at 0. And so the finer that needle is, the more incremental those adjustments can be, right? So if we put our 1-degree needle in, we can adjust your rebound close at 0 like every 15, 20 pounds, right? But if you have a typical 5-degree needle in for a left rear to get some adjustment like we'd run in a non-wing car, then that thing's going to jump every 50 or 60 pounds. Your rebound closed at 0. So yeah, a left rear shock that adjusts your low speed rebound on a wing car is super critical. On a non-wing car, we can't get enough rebound out of them with that needle because it takes your adjustment range from being this big and makes it this big. But they're very, very fine adjustments. So yeah, good question. That was it for my myths. Do you guys have any other questions? Fire away. More than happy to answer those. We will have our shock trailer at the BC39, parking that tomorrow. So that'll be there Wednesday and Thursday, servicing those customers. And then next week we'll be in Knoxville for the Knoxville Nationals. We're going to be parked at Chase Randall's shop, just about a block away from the track. So we'll have our trailer there. We can service and dyno anything you have there at the Knoxville Nationals. So we'll be getting to town sometime Tuesday-ish, I believe, and then be there throughout the week. So looking forward to that. Greg, inside info, Joseph Newgarden's wreck was reported that it was a damper. How does that break? Well, Penske, they always are developing the next generation of IndyCar damper on their house cars, the Team Penske cars, versus what they're selling to the public. That's like the reason Chip Ganassi, they build their dampers in-house. So IndyCar racing, for you dirt track, short track guys, it's like the Wild West when it comes to shocks, or what they call in IndyCar dampers, same thing. There is no rules other than can't be electronically adjustable, but you can build your own parts, pieces, everything, where NASCAR is like really regulated. Prior to the next gen car, which is a spec shock, it's a 4-way adjustable Öhlins. But the old ones, it was either an Öhlins, a Penske, or a JRI, and each manufacturer got like 3 pistons that were approved. So certain tracks the JRI would be better, and certain tracks the Penske would be better based on the pistons that they were allowed. But on the IndyCar side, it's the Wild West. I mean, you do whatever the heck you want. So my guess is they must be doing something with an air spring or something like that, because if a damper fails on an Indy car, especially at a short oval like Iowa, the spring would have enough to kind of keep that corner of the car up. So it might become ill handling, but there you almost saw the car drop. And unless the shaft broke, the car wouldn't drop. It wouldn't lose ride height if it blew a shock seal or something like that, it wouldn't lose ride height like that. So I've seen on street circuits from hitting curbs just blow the whole seal mechanism out of the shock, and we finished the race. Like, the driver started to report a vibration and whatnot, but it didn't lose ride height. So the way that thing lost ride height, either the rocker broke, or where the shock mounts or a shock mount broke, or they're working with some type of air spring or something for it to lose. Now, it could have been the hydraulic weight jacker. So on the Penske, the weight jacker is built into the damper. So rather than having a weight jacker that slides on, it's actually built into the body of their shock, which is really nice and clean. Now, if that failed, it would cause the spring to collapse, and they would lose ride height and brake. So maybe it was the hydraulic weight jacker within the damper that broke and caused the car to drop and wreck. So, yeah, good question. All right. Well, we appreciate you guys tuning in. Again, the previous 149 episodes are on our YouTube page. Please subscribe and watch those. And we hope to see you at a racetrack here soon, and hope you guys all have a fantastic rest of your week. Take care.